Hello there. I'd like to talk to you about the Great Exchange in Gorazde in 1994. I've mentioned aspects of this in other vignettes, but I thought that it merited its own little specific vignette. So, in 1994, the situation in eastern Bosnia was pretty dire. In the early part of the year, I was sent on arrival in Sarajevo to Gorazde to be a civil affairs officer there. Within a few days, I found myself as the head of the civil affairs there, which was quite interesting. And I started meeting the local authorities in the town of Gorazde and outside the Serb authorities that had the town surrounded. Now, when you say the authorities in those days, it was both civil authorities and military authorities on both sides. And of course, there was always tussling between the civil and military of their own kind, because the military felt they owned and ran everything, and because they controlled the security apparatus, that was to a certain extent true. And the civilians knew that come the day that the war stopped, it would be a civil administration and they would be running it. And so therefore they had the longer view and the longer perspective. So it was an interesting experience. It became clear fairly quickly that the reason why there had been no exchanges and no anything prior to 94 was that the Serbs accused the Muslims in Gorazde, who are completely surrounded and cut off, of having secret prisoners that they haven't registered with the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Muslim authorities said they had no secret prisoners, and the Serbs, in order to encourage them to register these secret prisoners, had simply stopped all humanitarian convoys from arriving with food and supplies arriving in the pocket. And for a very long time there had been no resupply. And so when I got there, the situation was absolutely dire, absolutely terrible. So I started shuttling between the two sides. It meant crossing the front line in a soft-skin vehicle, sometimes twice a day. And sometimes, just to give us a little thrill as we were crossing the front line, we would have the road pinged ahead of us with somebody from the front line just putting a bullet into the road to let us know that they knew exactly where the road was and exactly what a car looked like. And after a while, you just said, just either do it or don't do it. We don't care anymore. I started to say to the Serb authorities on the outside, guys, I'd really like to believe you, but I need evidence. I can't go to my superiors and say the Muslims are lying. I need evidence. What evidence do you have that there are secret prisoners? And of course, to start with, they were very skeptical of me, and I just said, I'm going to keep meeting with you, but we're really going nowhere. We're just spinning our wheels. And slowly, little tiny scrippity-scrappity bits of paper started to come. Paper that you could get, underneath your thumbnail if you were a friendly guard who was going to take something out and hand it over to someone else who would hand it over to a family on the other side. Because please don't think in wartime there's no exchange across the front lines of information, people, materials, whatever. It's going on everywhere. It's extremely dangerous. It's human nature. And these little scribbly scraps were what would be called, in a way, proof of life. The name of a family dog that only the person in prison would know. Little bits and pieces. So I went to the Muslim authorities. I said, guys, I've challenged the Serbs to produce evidence of secret unregistered prisoners. And you know what? Little scraps of circumstantial evidence are appearing. Little bits that, where I come from in my legal system, would be called constituting proof of life. And these guys looked at me very oddly. And I said, no, listen, I understand your military guys and your security guys don't like to share everything with you, but you maybe want to have a little meeting all privately and explain to them that if it turns out that they haven't registered with the International Committee of Red Cross certain prisoners because they think they've got an ace up their sleeve, that is an ace that will turn around and bite them, because they are breaking even more Geneva Conventions than the other guys. Just tell that to your people and whatever. Now, I had been also talking to our delegate. It happened that the ICRC delegate in Gorazde was a young guy, very, very enthusiastic, very keen. And he told me on about our second meeting, he said, look, we have been over every inch of that prison. If there were secret prisoners in there, we would know it. So he was very clear. There were no secret prisoners. It was a story being concocted by the damn Serbs. Well, one day I'm walking down the road after breakfast, going to go and call on I forget who, and the ICRC delegate came up to me, furious, shouting at me in the street, me. And what did you do? What have you done? I said, what do you mean, what did I do? What have I done? This morning, the Muslims registered 4 prisoners that have been in that prison all along, and we didn't know about it. I said, well, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. I didn't do anything. I'm sure it was the town authorities that registered them. Said, yes, but you know, and you've always... And I said, look, take the win. They're your prisoners now. You will visit with them. And then I could go to the Serb side and say, right, 4 were registered with the ICRC. No more sitting on your fannies. Let's get some serious negotiations going on. I want, as part of this, to get UNHCR food convoys into Gorazde. The people and the children are starving. Okay, so we started to meet, the great exchange. And then both the civil and the military authorities from the Muslim side and the civil and military authorities from the Serb side would meet in no man's land. And we would have these horrendous, ongoing, forever meetings. And, you know, in the plenary, you do the usual thing, you just smile and nod. And then when you're doing your bilaterals privately with one side or the other side, you can shout at them. You can really let them know what you think they're doing, that they're obfuscating or, you know, demanding too high a price. Whatever. And we quickly came into understand, I think a guy who's famous for saying this was actually General, later President Eisenhower, who said, if you've got a problem that's intractable, make it bigger, take it up a level, because you'll have more wiggle room up. You cannot drill down into intractable problems. You can take them up and put them in a bigger context. So when the one side wanted extra this, the others, instead of getting the other side to say no, you'd say, we'll have a little coffee break here. You take it to them and say, look, guys, it's a perfect opportunity. You, if they want extra that, say, you can have it, but only if you agree to extra others for us. And so we built up and built up and built up until finally this amorphous blobby mass, prisoners, bodies, convoys of food, school books, glue to repair shoes and boots, and all sorts of things were in there eventually that you wouldn't have started with that agenda, but you ended with that agenda because it could be successful. So we then had to take that up to the authorities in Sarajevo, which meant I had to take a Muslim delegation through the hardest of hardline Serb areas in eastern Bosnia. And to do that, we had British armoured vehicles called Saxons. And this is a Saxon in a museum. It looks like an ugly piece of ironmongery because it is an ugly piece of ironmongery. And it was all that the British Army had been issued and allowed to take down to Gorazde. They had much, much superior armoured fighting vehicles up in the central Bosnia around Travnik, but this is all they had in Gorazde. The send-off from Gorazde was quite hilarious. We were supposed to go at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, by 4 o'clock, the Muslim delegation were in the back of the Saxons. We had a Saxon in front. We had then the second Saxon carried the delegation and me, and the third Saxon had my Ukrainian partner in it. And my partner and I had worked out only he shouting to the port in the door and knocking in a certain way would get me to open the door, and I would be in charge of opening the door. We had to do this because prior to this, unfortunately in Sarajevo, the vice president of Bosnia, Muslim, coming back from the airport to a meeting back into Sarajevo. At one of the Serb checkpoints, the vehicle was stopped, the back door was thrown open, they were arguing and shouting, and after 2 hours, one of the Serb soldiers just stepped up to the back of the vehicle and shot dead the vice president of Bosnia. This made the Muslims somewhat suspicious of taking rides with the United Nations, and one can't really blame them for that. So anyway, this is the Saxon. This is what happens to a Saxon when it gets its front wheel blown off by a landmine. This could be anywhere in Bosnia. I'm not saying that this was outside Gorazde, but I am saying that the Saxons were in Gorazde, and that this one might have been unusually in some other part, taking some British soldiers there. But it's highly likely that it was this photograph was taken somewhere in Gorazde. Okay, so what then happened with the negotiations? We got to Sarajevo late at night with our Saxon convoy, and of course the Muslims weren't expecting us and didn't want to let us in. And so the head of the Muslim delegation got on to his cousin on the phone. He had a little brick Nokia. He got on to his cousin on the phone, who was in Sarajevo, who happened to be the Prime Minister, and said, listen, your idiot soldiers won't let us in. We've come through, all kinds of horrors on the road, and we finally got up here. We're meeting with President Izetbegovic tomorrow or the next day or whenever, and please phone somebody to get them to let us in. So about 20 minutes later, there's much apologizing and barricades are removed, and we drive in, and we were emotionally and physically knackered. There followed a 10-day period where within the Muslim establishment, they argued about this great deal. And what was astonishing is there was a faction, and there always, I guess, is a faction, who said, no deal. This is, in a way, legitimizing the Serbs' aggression against us by doing a deal with them to get them to send in humanitarian aid, which they are required by international law to do. And the wise and relatively quiet Izetbegovic sat through a few days of this and finally said, where we can help people in need, especially our own people, we're under a moral and religious obligation to do it. Just get to the negotiations and get the best deal you can at the table. So he sent the government level. We had done the local level. The government level went. Our deal, with all its bits and pieces, became the framework agenda. And then the two national delegations argued over it. They spent 5, 6, 7 days continually meeting, continually arguing, shouting, shutting down the talks, opening up the talks, and eventually settled on the identical paper that they were shown 5, 6 days previously. It was a good paper. It was a practical paper. It was ugly. It had all kinds of different bits and pieces in it, but it was there. Now, we then start the issue of the exchanges. The prisoners, including the secret prisoners in Gorazde, were exchanged for Muslims being held and sent back. What is a really sad thing to exchange? Prisoners are even worse. I didn't meet a single prisoner in the war in Bosnia who hadn't been horribly treated or disgracefully treated. So they were treated either bad or worse. There was essentially no good treatment. And there's nothing you can do about that. What we did was get people out of dreadful conditions of prison. We couldn't make what had already been done bad better. So this is not the Gorazde prisoner exchange. This is another prisoner exchange, but they're all like this. They're all very poignant. They're all tragic. And with this complicated deal, you do bodies, then a few days later you do prisoners, then all the while maybe a convoy is arriving or this. It's hugger-mugger, kaleidoscope, jigsaw puzzle. It all finally fits together. And believe me, the parties will let you know every day that the other side has broken the agreement. And by the end of the day, they'll go reluctantly back saying, well, maybe they hadn't broken it, but it looked as though they'd broken it. And just the next day, you know that it's going to be pulling teeth without anesthetic again. We finally get to the big thing, which are the convoys. Now, these 7 convoys were designed to go over a period of 10 months. And this was a huge leap of faith. It's one thing to have a all for all or a big exchange of stuff on a day and it's over. You can go back to shooting the next day. Somehow agreeing to supply these 7 convoys over time was really quite tricky. It required faith. It was a huge support to the peace process. It was a gamble worth taking. And it was particularly good for us political guys because they were UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees, convoys. So HCR had to provide the trucks and the stuff, and such credit as there was came to political civil affairs. So I kind of liked that one. That bit was rather good. And this is a typical UNHCR convoy heading off to deliver good news to some poor, poor people. So, if we look at the Cynefin framework, eventually after a while, meetings across the front line, meetings in no man's land become routine, and then you try to get the parties to say, right, let's alternate. You, the red guys, invite the blues to your side one meeting, and then the next meeting, you blue guys invite the red guys to your side to show that you can be trusted with their security as a way of demonstrating good faith. Well, they kind of lose face if they say no, and they're kind of narked if they say yes, but you kind of chivvy them along, you know, you get what little you can, because on the political side, our aim was to always further the bigger, more strategic peace process. I've talked about making the problem bigger, which in this case worked perfectly, and by and large it's something you should look at whenever you're negotiating, whatever deals you're negotiating. The issue was the complex side. And complex negotiations evolve, and they evolve breathing and feeding and drinking on trust and confidence. Whatever you can do to build trust and confidence, they will then be able to exploit and grow organically wherever they want it to grow. And the worst thing you can have is an international who's got a very clear idea of what the agenda should be and wants to keep the parties on the agenda. If the parties wish to wander into the woods and then back to the village and then off to another set of woods and down to the meadow and over to the stream, let them do it. If they're not killing each other, it's probably that they're exploring in their own way the limits and the possibilities and the red lines of each other, and they will get a much richer agreement if you let them do it. And sometimes you will go back to your little quarters that night and say, what the hell are these people up to? And sometimes they don't even know themselves. Not the point. You allow them to grow an organic agenda, which is their agenda, which they own. More chance of success than going in there with beautifully typed up point by point things, slapping one in front of the red, slapping one in front of the blues and saying, sign! It gets people annoyed, but you'd be surprised. You do have international negotiators who've made their name doing that, but it's normally because in their back pocket they have an immense hammer, military hammer, or a stick with which they can beat the parties. If you don't have an immense hammer or immense stick, you've got to get the parties to grow together organically. And that was the biggest exchange, the most complicated exchange that I ever took part in. And to this day, I can't help but feel a little bit pleased with what the locals achieved, with just a little bit of facilitation and help from the internationals on the outside.